come make some faceted opal gemstone cookies with me. Did you know that you could have faceted opals? It was relatively new to me. The cool thing about this set is that not only are we decorating cookies with lines, my least favorite decorating technique to create that faceted look, but to make this a more fun set, in my mind, we are going to be dipping cookies. So the first thing we're going to do is mixing our icing. Next to piping lines, mixing icing is my least favorite part of cookie decorating. The first thing we're doing is making the white. That is what we are going to be piping the lines with. So we are looking to create a 15-20 second kind of hybrid icing consistency. It's not a line, it's not a flood, it's both. And then we're going to create our colors for dipping. Now this consistency, we're going to go a little bit thinner. I like a 10-second consistency for dipping. So the great thing about when you're dipping cookies is you really don't have to get the consistency kind of as perfected as you do when you are piping onto the cookies. So obviously that first one that we mixed for the white, where we want it to be a little thicker, we want it to hold its shape. Now when you're dipping the cookies, you want it to be very flowy. So that's why you want that kind of like 10-second, as long as it's just kind of falling off the spatula, not too much, not just like immediately falling off the spatula, but in a nice flow. And we're making more pastel colors for this as well. So you can see we started with kind of like that reddish pink. Now we're doing a light blue and it just flows right off. We're not making a lot of this either. And you'll also note for the red and the blue, I took a toothpick because I didn't want those colors to be too saturated. And again, here I am with the toothpick for the blue, and I didn't quite get enough on the toothpick, and I didn't want to put it back in my bottle because it has icing on it. So I'm at the end of my blue. So I'm just kind of like not getting a full drop compared to the yellow to make this green. Adding about a teaspoon of water. You can see maybe a quarter of a cup of icing in there to make this green. So we have this red, pink, a blue, a green, mixing, and you can see I didn't clean the bowl in between. It's called a one bowl method. And then the last thing we're going to do is find a container we can dip our cookies into. So you want to make sure that your fingers can fit in there, and it's also just not too much extra space. I don't have a circle container for this. I just found a Tupperware, and I'm putting almost the rest of my icing in there, and we're just going to leave it white. And we want it to get to the same consistency as our pastel icing. And so I'm just mixing this in here. I'm going slow as to not get water all over the table, which I often do, and just mixing in the container because I don't need to mix it in a different container. This is the one I'm going to be dipping in, so this is the one I might as well mix it in. And just doing that until we get to that 10-second-ish consistency and getting all the corners and mixing it all together really well. One thing that you might want to change when it comes to baking your cookies is making them a little bit thicker when you're dipping them, so you don't dip your fingers into the icing. If you do the thickness I typically do for my cookies, which I'm blanking on, I want to say like 8 millimeters, but that's a complete shot in the dark on how thick that is. But if I can only picture with my Joseph & Joseph rolling pin that has the spacers, it's the purple one. The purple one is thicker, and I bought a specific one because I didn't like the purple and I didn't like the one that was one step down. Anywho, this is all mixed. The next thing I'm going to do is kind of let this sit for a while so we can kind of let all the air bubbles pop off, come to the top. And I'm just going to lay out my space. So I want my parchment paper down, my decorating, my icing, my scissors. The icing we're going to dip into my cookies, paper towel. Next up, we're going to cut the tips of the piping bags, get them ready for decorating. And for these colored ones, we actually don't have to be that specific. We don't have to be that tiny. So just cutting off the end. And I'm not even going to turn them 90 degrees like I typically recommend, because this icing is going to go straight over our dipping icing. That's how we get that kind of opal effect. So it doesn't, we don't need to make sure that the icing's not curling or anything, because it's not going to matter. And they don't all have to be like a thin size, because it's not going to matter. I will say, when it comes to cutting for the white icing, this is our line consistency, you are going to want to be more precise. So I start off with cutting along the seam. So the seam is on the side. And I actually had some icing stuck on the scissors, so I needed to clean that off first. So back to cutting. The seam is on the side. We're going to cut straight across and then turn it 90 degrees, turn the bag 90 degrees so that that seam is straight up. And I'm using my fingers to turn this because I don't want the icing coming out. And you might be able to see it's not straight across. This is part of the reason why I do 2 cuts, because it helps create that kind of like perfect circle on the end. And that helps have better lines. I will say I cut this hole too big, and I ended up putting this icing in a new icing bag and cutting a smaller hole because I didn't like how my lines were looking. So we're going to go back to that icing we were letting set, and you're going to take a spoon or a spatula and just lightly go over the top to try and get rid of these air bubbles you're seeing popping up there. A lot of people get really into having no air bubbles. It has really never been something that's bugged me. So we're going to go straight into dipping. This is the fun part. You're going to layer on your icing colors. And this is why it doesn't matter if they curl or anything, because there's not much of an art to this, if I'm being honest. What you get is what you get. You're going to take your cookie, dip it in. I kind of like swirl it around a little bit so I can make sure each all tops of the entire top of my cookie is covered. And you can see, there we go. If there's anything that's not covered, or I start seeing air bubbles, like that was a big air bubble, I use my scribe to kind of move it around and kind of pop those initial air bubbles. And then you just set your cookie aside and you repeat the process. So you layer down the colors you want to use so we can create this cool opal effect. And here it is from the side, so you can get just another perspective. I wasn't finding there was any difference in the technique for how I was putting the colors down. Didn't really seem to make a difference at all. What order, what style. And I really am working to not get my fingers touching the icing. I will say that part takes practice, especially if you have a thinner cookie. And you can see, sometimes you just end up with these weird covers. Why did it not cover the whole cookie? I don't know. I can't tell you, but that's what we pull our scribe out for, and we just make sure that icing goes straight to the edge. And we got a good opal cookie base. And you're going to want to do that for all of your cookies before you come in with the lines. And just make sure you get things evened out. It doesn't matter if you had to move your icing around and therefore your pattern's a little different. It just doesn't matter. Okay, we're going to go straight into the lines. So the first cookie we're going to do is going to be the most complicated. And there are breakout videos for each of these if you just want to watch each individual cookie being decorated. So I start with putting a dot in the center, and then I create kind of a box around it with dots. And then I'm adding a dot in between each of those. And this is just, the dots they're just creating guidelines for where you're going to be piping. So we're going to go straight across, turn it, and then go straight across again. We're connecting 3 dots in a row, essentially. Now, I will say, one of the major things that I wish I had done differently in this set is, instead of doing dots, because it left behind icing, I wish I had taken my scribe and poked holes. But what you risk with that is your holes might be bigger than what your icing will cover, or if you make a mistake, you can't just scrape it off and start over. So next, after we created that star pattern in the middle, you're going to go out, I don't know, halfway between where your star pattern ends and where your cookie ends, and put a dot in between each of those lines. How I am vocally giving you these instructions hopefully makes sense. Um, watch the visual. That's all I can say. Watch the visual. So now you're going to create little triangles extending from that initial star to the dots you put about halfway out from that star. So they'll look like diamonds in the end. And then after you finish that diamond, take a single line out to the end of the cookie. And you're going to repeat that for all of these dots. So I do a line up to that dot, and then a second line up to that dot, and then a line out. And if you can kind of easily connect the dot and then continue with your icing to the line out, then you're going to be less likely to leave kind of a blob of icing behind. And this is part of the reason why I wish I had poked holes instead of used dots of icing, because it just created a little bit of extra icing and it didn't make the line look as nice. And as I have already said multiple times, line work is my least favorite part about cookie decorating because it's such a challenge for me. Now, I've seen some beginners be like absolutely excellent with lines, and it's the type of thing for me. I could practice it every day and there would be improvements, don't get me wrong, but it's still not going to be something I'm great at. And part of that is the icing consistency, and another part of that is how you cut your piping bag, and then another part of that is just pressure, your piping pressure. So there's a lot of different factors that go into this. Okay, so we've completed our kind of initial star and line out, and now on the edge of the cookie between each of those lines you're going to do a little dot or a little mark with your scribe. Completely up to you. And this is again giving us some guidelines on where we're going to be piping next. So now you're going to go from that final corner of the diamond and you're going to pipe out to that dot, and then you're going to pipe down from that dot to the other corner. What you're doing is you're creating another diamond. It's just a slightly different diamond shape. And this is that facet we're going for. The cuts on gemstones that you see, that's the kind of shape we're going for, and this is our most complicated one. Another thing I will note, at the end of the video, and also if you go all the way back to the beginning, you can see that I have two different thicknesses of lines. This is the thinner version. I don't think I have any videos showing the thicker version because I did not like it, and I made a decision to pull out another piping bag, empty the icing into the new piping bag, and cut a smaller line because the lines were just too thick and this one looks so much better. Okay, so we finished all of those diamonds. Now we're going to finish the cookie by just doing a line along the outside edge of the cookie. Like with everything in all of my sets, this is completely optional. You might not like the line on the edge of the cookie. I think it really completes the facet. If you were looking down at this on your hand, it would look complete, like a gemstone, and not a cookie at all. Okay, I'm lying, but I do think the outline really completes it. Now we're moving on to the next one. This one, you're going to start by creating 4 dots in the shape of a square. Harder than you might think. And then again, oh, I got ahead of myself. Once you have those 4 dots, you're going to pipe lines to make that a full square. And this is another time where if I had made dots with my scribe instead of piping them, there just wouldn't have been that extra bulk of icing right there. That's purely it. I'm being very nitpicky with how this looks because I do actually think my line work is okay, but I have that extra bit. Okay, now you're going to come in and you're essentially going to make a square turned 90 degrees, and so you want 4 dots. I'm trying to make them as small as possible at this point because I've already thought they look a little too bulky. And this is going to go over the top. So we're making another square, connecting those 4 dots together. And we want kind of those corners of the first square peeking out. That is part of this faceted design. And some keys to having good lines here is going slowly. It honestly, the slower you go, kind of the better the line work goes, and letting your icing really flow out of the piping bag and not so much forcing it out of the piping bag. Now here, I'm just kind of trying to correct that line a little bit. Once you have those two squares overlapping one another, you're going to pipe a line from each corner to the end of the cookie. And you can see I'm not touching my piping bag to the cookie. I'm letting my icing just barely flow out of the piping bag and fall onto the cookie. And this can help me not have those big blobs of icing at the end. Like I said, there's a lot of factors to how you get those blobs of icing. So it can be a number of things. One of the factors is letting your icing fall out of the piping bag freely. Okay, now that you have lines from each corner going out, in between each of those lines, put a dot on the edge of the cookie. And you just want them halfway between each of those lines. And like with the first cookie, what we're going to do is create kind of diamond triangle shapes here. So you're going from the corner to that dot on the edge of the cookie again. And you're just going to continue this all the way around, creating these sort of triangles. I don't want to fully commit to saying they're a triangle because there are technically 4 sides to this. You piped 2 of them already. But we're making like a triangle shape. One thing that I would probably change about this cookie is I'd make the squares a little bit bigger. At the end, I just felt it looked a little too liney, if that makes any sense. And I wished the squares in the middle were, I don't know, like a centimeter bigger, kind of all the way around. Now, I was ending with a little bit too much, I don't want to say blobs. There was a little too much extra icing of lines on the edge of the cookie, so I grabbed my scribe to kind of scrape that away, just straight down the side of the cookie to get rid of that extra icing. And we're just going to continue from corner to dot. And you can see my line broke a little bit there. Instead of trying to immediately fix it, I just want to finish my line and very slowly go back and pipe a little bit of extra icing just on that spot. And I don't want to try and just do that spot. I want to continue a little further, again, so I don't get any clumps or lumps coming through. So we have one more of these triangles, for lack of a better term, to pipe on. And then we're once again going to outline the edge of the cookie with just a border of that white icing. Lining icing is what I wanted to say there. Don't know if that makes any sense. One thing, I mean, you can do this for every single cookie set. You can change anything you want. So if you don't like the opal dipping technique, you can certainly just instead have whatever colors you want and just do a base of that color. Okay, this last cookie is the easiest in the set, and also the one I found the most challenging. So we're once again doing 4 dots to make a square shape on the cookie, so you kind of want them equidistant apart, and then you're going to pipe a square. But the one thing that I learned doing this is the 3rd time I did it, is to have the square kind of, the lines going a little bit concave. So they're going in a little bit. We want them to look like straight lines, but also have a little bit of a curve to them. And it just made the cookie a little bit more interesting. Again, if your line breaks, it's okay. You're just gonna go over it a little bit again. It's gonna look fine. It's totally gonna look fine. And you're gonna continue to make that square shape with those concave lines. I'm now doubting whether I understand what the word concave means. And you're not going to care that your square's a little bit more like a rectangle than it is a square, because it's kind of hard to pipe a square on a round cookie. And then you're going to do 4 dots again, kind of 90 degrees, so that we can have these overlapping squares like we just did on the previous cookie. And once again, you're going to pipe on those lines to make the square and have them curve a little bit. And we're going to keep going, curving them a little bit. You want to think about, because we're doing faceted gemstones, that is this whole set. So you want to think about rings and how they aren't just a flat shape like this. So the curve is creating more of a visual appeal for these cookies. But this one is the simplest out of the set. It's the easiest to do while also the most challenging for me, because I apparently just don't have the spatial awareness to understand equidistance between dots. Once you have those 2 squares piped on, you're going to outline this cookie again with that same icing, just a thin edge of the cookie to complete this design for you. And one thing I want to show is just the comparison between a thicker line, the one I started with, and the one I ended with. And you can see how much neater the one I ended with is, just because the icing was able to flow out of the bag so much better. And it's just a hugely noticeable difference. Here are all of the cookies in all of their glory. Please give them a try and let me know how they turn out for you.